why this webinar series. It's in response to some of the Education Scotland recent reviews and some of the aspect reports, and there were 3 or 4 sort of big concepts there that needed addressing, particularly in theory sessions. First one was questioning, this one is differentiated approaches to learning. So here we go. Today I'm just going to go through differentiation. Let's simplify that. There's been a whole cottage industry around this whole educational concept of differentiation, and they've actually theorised it, the whole concept itself, and I really do think that differentiation as a concept, there's too much made of it, because as part of the learning and teaching process, it's actually quite straightforward to evidence and to show that you are differentiating. So we'll try and simplify that. Differentiated approaches that can power up your theory sessions. I'll give you some ideas and tips and techniques. If anybody asks how are you differentiating, well, this is what we do. And then I think we need to say, well, what's within our sphere of influence there to differentiate. So that's where I'm going. But before we get into the webinar itself, just so that I can see that you're all out there, George is going to drag across a poll question just to get us started. So how's your day been so far, folks? Just click in the box. So mainly good. Some don't ask. I think if you were asking me, I'd probably put don't ask myself. George, poll question. There we are. And just to get your kind of thoughts there, planning differentiated approaches is a major headache. Disagree and I'm not sure. Yeah, it's changing there. Not sure. Okay, hopefully by the end of this we will all agree that it's not a major headache. So thanks for that, George. Okay. Why this webinar? I suppose the main thing was there's not enough differentiated approaches to learning. This is something that's been picked up in a couple of the reports so far, and also not enough evidencing the differentiation as part of the learning process. So I think my starting point is, what do we mean by a differentiated approach? Well, any learning approach is your underpinning thinking and your underpinning philosophy of how you approach the learning and teaching process, and that makes it different from the methods, because the approaches that we use, we all have a wide range of methods and techniques and strategies for differentiation. But I think the thing for me is, if anybody asked me, tell me right away how you're differentiating your approaches to learning, I think my first response would be the mix and variety of my learning approaches that I use. And certainly in learning and teaching approaches, there are probably 5 main ones, and certainly in our sector, we instruct, we demonstrate, we observe, we shape up the learning, we facilitate the learning, and we also monitor the progress of our learners. And I suppose for me, that's the feedback word. So a starting point is that we differentiate our learning and teaching approaches. We mix up our approaches, as well as mixing up our methods and our strategies for differentiation. So I just wanted to make that kind of distinction between learning and teaching approaches and the differentiation we can do there, and some of the resources, the tips and the techniques that we can use. Is there anything new around differentiation? I would probably say no, not if it is perceived as effective learning and teaching, because lecturers, teachers and training providers, it's a natural and intuitive part of the learning process, but it does require planning, particularly with the mix and diversity of students that we have in the sector. And I think it's important to raise at this point, if we differentiate the learning and teaching, we also have to differentiate our assessment assessment strategies as well. And certainly as a young naive teacher many years ago, I used to differentiate my learning and teaching, but I still gave them the summative assessments, which was just madness. But experience certainly got me to the stage where if I differentiate my sessions, I have to differentiate my assessment as well. And I suppose the one new thing for me is, yes, the kind of big push on technologies for learning, that too enhances the differentiated approaches as well. And I know that in our sector, whether we're doing teaching qualifications in the sector or we're being reviewed, there's always this search for the use of technologies to enhance differentiated approaches. But I'm quite clear that we only use the technology for differentiation if it's better than me doing it as part of the learning and teaching process. Where technologies can do it better, I'm absolutely fine with that. So I'm going to just have a quick pause for thought there. I've highlighted my kind of thinking around what does the phrase differentiated approaches mean to you, and I've separated out the approaches from the methods. But if I say differentiated approaches and what that means to you, in the chat box, can you just put whatever comes into the top of your head, and I'll mute my microphone for a moment. So just think about that. What does the phrase differentiated approaches mean to you? No right or wrong answers, just put some stuff in the chat box so I can see what your own thoughts are. Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, variety of learning and teaching approaches, I would certainly agree with that. Yes, learning preferences. For a number of years there was a lot of educational debate about we have to differentiate so we meet a variety of learning styles and learning preferences. And again, being quite a straightforward person when it comes to learning and teaching, for me, if we mix up the learning and teaching approaches, we're going to tap into the learning styles and preferences of the majority of our students. Thanks for that, Michael. Using multiple pedagogy to suit students' needs. Yes, I was looking at that's a nice point. I was looking at our professional standards, and the initial standards, not the CPD standards, and I did a search for the word differentiation. Interestingly enough, the word differentiation only appears once in the actual standards itself. Which is fine because it appears in the standard for facilitating learning, and it's in the content bit there, and I'll just quote from this. It says, differentiating strategies that contextualize and personalize the learning experience. Yeah, I think that personalization bit is quite important, the point that Michael's made there, to suit student needs. I would suggest we can't personalise it for absolutely everybody, but if we differentiate our approaches and our methods and our techniques, then we are going to be well down that road of personalisation. But as you know, the mix and diversity of students that are in front of you, it's virtually impossible to do that high level personalisation for 25 to 30 students. But if you differentiate as part of the learning and teaching process, then I would suggest that we will not have much problem differentiating that. So thanks for putting that in the chat box. I've just put in, you may have thought about the teaching approaches, personalisation, which I picked up there. It's also about planned intervention, particularly when you know your students, you know what their strengths and their development needs are. So you plan for the intervention, and simple things like questioning techniques are just such a good differentiator, because you differentiate the questions, as I said in webinar 1, once you know the mix and diversity of your students. So that to me is a planned intervention, when I really think about my questioning techniques, and questioning techniques are just the most obvious differentiator, and I don't want to labour that point because we looked at questioning in webinar 1. I suppose the one that I use most of all when I'm working with students is the level of support. That definitely is an obvious one. Some students require more of my time, more of my input, more of my support, but not only do we have to differentiate for those that take longer time to grasp the concepts we're teaching, we also have to be very mindful of our professional responsibilities to the students who grasp the concepts really quickly. I suppose we're talking about the fast finishers, those who grasp it and move on. So we need to differentiate for those students that just pick up the concepts really quickly. Resources are another one, and that's an obvious differentiator, and in our initial professional standards, part of that differentiation is identifying, evaluating and choosing resources that will help you get your concepts across. As with any learning, we start with our starting point for planning our interventions are, what do we want the students to learn? What do we want them to know? What do we want them to be able to do as a result of the input? And then you plan the resources that you use, but the resources you use are a good example of differentiation. And as I said, perhaps if you're using a lot more technology, that is a good differentiator. Some of you will be using the flipped classroom and giving students tasks before they come to the face-to-face sessions, so that you've established some of the concepts, the language around the learning. Feedback's another one, the levels of feedback that you give. Some students will need more feedback than others, but feedback is a very obvious differentiator, and it's an intuitive and natural part of the learning process. And we talked about the whole range of questioning techniques that we use, from simple procedural and recall to much higher order questions and of prediction and inference. So I hope, and I can pick up that from the chat box contributions there, I think you have actually covered most of these. But if we're looking at differentiation in its purest simplicity factor form, I've put down two things there. It's about adapting the teaching approaches that enable students to make progress, and it's also different ways of interacting with your lecturer and resources. And I think that's where the technology comes in as a good differentiator, because it is a different way of interacting. But we may have a different way of interacting by the resource that we use, the questions that we ask, and the level of feedback that we give. But for me, I think we've probably made differentiation into something that's big and weird and wonderful. It's not. I don't want to simplify it so far, but for me it's good learning and teaching, and it's that breadth of learning approaches that we use and the breadth of methods that we engage with to make sure that we differentiate our sessions for all the learners that are sitting in front of us. So let's dig a wee bit deeper and have a look at some of the main differentiation tips and techniques, or methods rather than the teaching approaches. Many of us will differentiation by content. Now, there's very little that's within the lecturer's sphere of influence here, because if we're teaching a programme, there are clear learning outcomes. It's an absolute given. But I think we can differentiate by the learning outcomes of a particular programme or qualification that we are delivering. The most obvious differentiator for me is my starting point is I actually explain what the learning outcomes are. And I think part of the up-to-date knowledge on learning and teaching is we have to give the students a route map. This is what we're learning, here are the learning outcomes, but we really have to explain what those learning outcomes are. So my differentiation by content is I focus on the learning outcomes, I explain what they are, I tell them this is what we're going to be learning, this is how we're going to do it, and of course this is how we're going to assess it as well. So there are ways to differentiate that by content, even by something as simple as looking at the learning outcomes of a programme that you are delivering. Unfortunately, college curriculum is still very much driven by SQA, City and Guilds or other qualifications, and we're totally obsessed with learning outcomes. But I think part of that differentiation approach is explaining them, unpacking them, and sharing with learners, here's the route map. And I always like to say to students, some of us will get there quicker than others. So that's differentiation by content. Not a lot we can do there, but as part of the learning and teaching process, it's definitely one that you can evidence. Differentiation by level and pace. Some of the recent reports have said that some of the lessons they have observed in our sector are pace is too slow, the level's not challenging enough, and I thought, well, what do they actually mean by that? Because many of those reports give us the what, but they don't often tell us the how. So what is differentiation by level and pace? Students are working in the same content, the same curricular area, but they interact in different ways with the lecturers and resources. And what I mean by that is part of that interaction is the level of support. Some of my students will need more input, they'll need more support, they'll need greater clarification, they'll need greater elaboration, they'll just need a bit more time spent with me. So that's a different way of interacting, whereas the students who grasp my concepts quickly, we can give them much more challenging stuff, and we can ask them to do some peer support as well, so that's definitely a differentiator there. And of course the resources as well. We will use resources once we know our students, and we can signpost and indicate our students to resources of different levels of difficulty. So that's what I mean by level and pace. I think many people pick up on that, where they're criticised that the pace is not good enough or that the level's not good enough, they equate that with we need to charge through the work. No, it's about consolidating and reinforcing the learning and the knowledge and understanding as much as moving through the learning. So it is very much about the interaction in different ways, and that's often the level of support and the resources that are used. And I know that with many of my students, I'll have to spend a lot more time reinforcing, consolidating, and working with them. So that's a wee bit about differentiation by level and pace. The big one, the most common differentiator that any teacher, lecturer or training provider use is differentiation by support. And if somebody said to me, how do you differentiate, my top one would be differentiation by support, probably followed closely by differentiation by the questioning techniques that I use. It's about the support that the lecturer or the teacher gives. I think I've spent long enough on that one. There's support that you can have from peers, and quite often I use peers to support some of the students who are not grasping the concepts as quickly as others. I've talked about technology and also cooperative learning as well. The individual, the pair work, the group work that we do, particularly during theory sessions, all the cooperative learning we do there, the collaboration, the discussion, the dialogue, that's all good evidence of differentiation by support. And I know it's almost like stating the obvious to very experienced practitioners that we have listening this afternoon, but sometimes a back to basic approach can just say, that's why I do it. That's the reason why I approach it this way, because I'm just doing natural and intuitive differentiation as part of that process. So I'm going to differentiate now by butting out for a minute or two. So I've just I've done a lot of input around differentiation. So again, just a pause for thought. What do you think so far? And you're allowed to say rubbish, I'm absolutely fine with that, but really just the sort of things I've talked about, the differentiators, what do you think so far? That's the answer I was hoping to see, Susan. Thank you. You are doing this stuff, yes, as part of the learning process. Sometimes it just needs that extra push to sort of say, well, I am doing that, and sometimes it just takes somebody like me just to point it out that we are doing that stuff. So that's brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Kerry. Yes. But you've never really yeah, that's good. As long as I'm reassuring you that you're already doing that, that's great. Thank you, Michael. That's good that I'm giving you the reassurance there. Yes, nice one from Claire there. If you know your students, you know the tasks, you can set them, yeah. And takes a wee bit of time and a bit of, that's that planned intervention. Once you know the students, your differentiation can be planned. Fantastic. Thank you for that. That's reassuring for me. So that's great. So moving on then to some other differentiators. Differentiation by feedback. Again, that's probably something that's part of the learning and teaching process, but it's also feedback you give on summative assessments as well. Some of you will have to give lots of feedback. Some of the students that you work with will need a lot less feedback because of the level and pace that they are learning at. But for me, any feedback should not be given me bucket loads of extra work. Feedback for me is about bouncing responsibility back onto the learner or the student, and I think that's quite important. Good feedback should make the learners work harder, whatever their level of ability, and I'll be doing some stuff on feedback as part of the webinar series in webinar 4. I'm really pushing that whole concept of feedback, but the feedback that you give is a good, powerful differentiator. That's what moves learning forward, and if we get the quality of the feedback right, then we differentiate that feedback. And again, whether it's written feedback or oral feedback or as part of the questioning and the plenary activities that we're doing as part of learning and teaching, we're always giving feedback, and that's just a natural part of the process. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't give feedback, and I think one of the nicest compliments I ever had from a student was, "Gary, you don't actually tell us anything." And for me, that was actually really good because it showed that as a differentiator, I was coaxing the information and the answers out of them in a collaborative, a cooperative, and a facilitative way. But feedback is another powerful differentiator, and you know your students. I think, as Claire said, if you know your students, you know the amount of feedback that you can give them. It is a most obvious differentiator. And another differentiator is your structure and how you shape up your learning sessions. I'm a great believer in this. I like structure, but some of the current thinking around learning and teaching is that we should be less structured in our approach. I'm not sure if I agree about that. I mean, I still like my 4-point structure that I use, and tomorrow I'll be working with a group of fairly new and beginning lecturers, and I'll be sharing my assessment is for learning model for shaping up sessions, because for me, I think it just gives a nice this whole kind of approach of direct interactive learning and teaching. But you'll differentiate by your structure, and by that I mean how long will you spend on the introduction, how long will you spend on the instructing and demonstrating, the observing, how long you'll spend on your feedback or clarifying or elaborating. You will know yourself, and as Claire said in the chat box, once you know your students, you'll know the best way to structure up your sessions. But again, when I'm asked by Education Scotland, how are you differentiating, I always refer them to the structure of my lesson plan and say, well, I'm differentiating it because I need to spend more on my direct interactive teaching and more on my questioning as part of the plenary session in my theory session that I'm working with the students. So something as basic as the structure you put around your session that is a differentiator, because you may spend longer on some parts of your session than others, and that is just such an obvious differentiator. So that's differentiation by structure. And differentiation by questioning. I'm not going to spend a long time on this, colleagues, because you can listen to my questioning webinar, but we do differentiate by question. I just wanted to pick on the two bottom points there, by reflection and critical thinking. That's how we get our students to evidence critical thinking and reflection on their learning, by the differentiated questions that we ask. And that's entirely up to yourselves. As part, you will have your own questioning techniques within the constraints of the curriculum that you're delivering. But good questions differentiate, get your students reflecting, and get your students into critical thinking. And a basic reflection question is, as part of your session, is what do you know now you didn't know before? What can you do now that you can't do before? That's reflection. Critical thinking, it can be something as straightforward as, but what do you need to know more about? What do we need to do more of to get you to overtake that learning outcome or that learning intention of the module or that part of the unit of the qualification? So differentiation by question, an absolute no-brainer. We do it all the time. What is good questioning? I've just taken that as a link from the last webinar. It's active learning and engagement, as well as a differentiation technique. It provides challenge and enjoyment. It deepens our knowledge and understanding, promotes our reflection, and coaxes out the answer. But I just wanted to emphasize that good questioning is differentiation as well. Yep, I think I've done that. Feedback should be like a good murder, but there's no such thing as a good murder. I remember Taggart in the old days, when people used to, when they saw the actor Mark McManus, they used to walk past him and shout things like, "There's been a murder." Apparently he didn't actually say that, but a murder, if it's difficult to solve, should have motive, means, and opportunity. And I think that's something that we need to be very mindful of about feedback. It should have motive, it should have opportunity, and it should have the means to respond to that feedback. So if you remember anything else about my webinar this afternoon, you'll remember feedback's like a good murder, but there is no such thing as a good murder. Okay, again in the chat box, I'm just about there, in fact, and that's bang on time. We started bang on time, and I'm 1 minute over. But pause for thought. In the chat box, identify one thing you found interesting in this webinar, differentiated approaches. So mute my microphone there. There might be more than one thing, there might be nothing, but that would be really good feedback for me so that I can differentiate my next webinar. One thing that you found interesting. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Susan. I like it when people agree with me, but I also like it when people disagree with me. But I know that sometimes I get a wee bit grumpy about learning and teaching, and I say controversial things. But one of my most controversial is that there's absolutely nothing new in learning, teaching, assessment. But it's a good challenge. Thank you, Claire. That's good. I'm pleased that you've picked up on that. Kerry, thank you. The emphasis on feedback. Yep. There's just a few more comments coming into the chat box, which is good. I'll just wait a moment or two. Right, Claire. Yes, I'll pick that up on the webinar 4 when I'm looking at feedback, which is my assessment is for learning structure, and if you're able to join for that. But what I can do is we have your email address, and I can make sure that you get the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, but just before you escape, George is going to bring across just a couple of poll questions. So George, if you bring across number 3. So, differentiated approaches to assessment is really hard, giving awarding body requirements. Okay, right, so there's 2 people come in there with, yeah, not sure. Okay, perfect, thank you very much. And the last poll question. I know more about differentiated approaches after participating in this webinar. Fantastic, 100%. You're the best audience ever. Fantastic. So if George just takes us back to the presentation, that would be great. I think I just want to say thank you for listening and thank you for participating both in the chat box and our poll questions. I'm going to hang about for a couple of minutes. I like hanging about, particularly when it's talking about learning and teaching. Claire said she would like to find out more about the lesson structure theory session, and I'll make sure that gets to Claire. But if there's any questions that you want to put in the chat box, I'll just wait for a minute or two. If not, thank you for joining and enjoy the rest of your week.